Let's bring Tyson Slocum into our discussion on climate change and news coming out of that conference in Peru. He's the director of a nonprofit that advocates affordable, clean, and sustainable energy. Thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, it's my pleasure.
So should richer countries do more? We just heard in this report that more developing countries say, hey, we need a chance to develop too. We haven't been around as long doing what these other countries like the U.S. and China have. What do you think of that?
Well, I do think that wealthier countries do need to provide some financing for adaptation to the effects of climate change for the global south, for these poor countries. And like your report said, there's been about $9.5 billion committed to this Green Development Fund, of which the United States has pledged $3 billion. These poor countries are saying that's not enough, but I think actually that's a pretty good start. But more important than that money for adaptation for the poorer countries is real commitments by the largest emitters, the United States, China, the European Union, and others, to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. And I think that's the key, and that's the most important part of any global framework on climate change.
So the U.S. committing $3 billion, is that realistic? Can the United States deliver despite everything that's going on domestically here? We have a deadlocked Congress. Is this going to happen?
That is going to be difficult. There's no question that the Republican majorities in the Senate and the House for next Congress have been very hostile to any efforts by the executive branch, by the Obama administration, to address climate change issues, which is why it's very interesting that on the agreements that the Obama administration is reaching with China and other countries, it's actually outside of the jurisdiction of the Senate to have to ratify them because these are kind of handshake deals and not firm commitments to have an idea to reduce emissions, that it's something that doesn't take congressional consent. Getting the money, however, is going to need some congressional consent. But I think that the Obama administration has several years to try and achieve that.
The EU says mandatory carbon emission cuts should be set for all countries, but the U.S. says individual countries should be able to adjust the scale and the pace of reductions themselves. Is that a good idea? Because this is the first time the EU has come out and publicly said something of this magnitude.
Right. There's no question that the United States' position on this is not ideal. I think that the European Union's position that all countries should have a legally binding emission reduction goal, that you'd have third-party legally binding verification of it, that's the only thing that's going to result in real meaningful emission reductions. What the Obama administration is doing is saying, well, no, we should just be able to have commitments that aren't legally binding to reduce emissions. And while that isn't as strong, I think it just reflects the more realistic issue that the United States cannot get the consent of the Republican Congress and the Senate to agree to legally binding cuts. So I think the Obama administration is doing everything they can unilaterally without consent of Congress, and that's why they're taking this more flexible approach. So while it's not ideal, I think that at least having negotiations and discussions and targets is a great first step.
And still with this U.S.-China commitment agreed upon last month to cut emissions in the next decade and a half, then you have this announcement today that 2014 could be the hottest on record. Could this really set the tone for this conference in Lima? Is this maybe putting the pressure on some of these other countries?
It's definitely a call to action, and it validates all the work of the diplomats and activists that are working in Lima. And this is, as your report said, a setup for the big conference in Paris next December. I think the fact that the Obama administration, working with China and other countries, have made progress in making agreements that climate change is a priority, that we've got to reduce emissions, that's a great position and much better than where we were just a few years ago.
All right, we'll have to see how this plays out. Tyson Slocum, we appreciate your time. Thanks for your perspective.
My pleasure.